This is episode 83 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Philippa Brawl, writer and lead historian at British History Tours. Another great method for studying history of Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Traders from all parts came to Smithfield. It eventually spread beyond the Priory. The cloth fair became less relevant probably around Queen Elizabeth's reign. The market aspect of the fair became less important, so the entertainment became a bigger part of it, and it grew into a kind of carnival.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
One of the biggest and grandest events occurring in London every year during Shakespeare's lifetime was the elaborate Bartholomew Fair. Celebrated in conjunction with St. Bartholomew's Day, this fair took over the city in Shakespeare's lifetime for 3 whole days full of merriment that included the selling of wares, drinks, and food vendors, as well as performances from stilt walkers, jugglers, puppeteers, and more. Here this week to share with us the history of Bartholomew Fair in Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as how this festive carnival was born from pious means, is our guest, Alicja Zelazko. Alicja Zelazko is an arts and humanities editor at Encyclopedia Britannica, where she covers topics in the visual arts, architecture, music, and performance. A few of her articles include Why is the Mona Lisa so famous?, What's inside the Great Pyramid?, and encyclopedic entries on Frida Kahlo, Girl with a Pearl Earring, and The Starry Night. She holds an MA in art history and previously worked at the Art Institute of Chicago and taught courses in art appreciation. Hello, Alicja. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Originally, Bartholomew Fair was a chartered event, but what does it mean for a monarch to charter a fair? And was this the only chartered fair?
Bartholomew Fair was not unique in having a charter. Such fairs as Southwark and Stourbridge were also chartered. The founder had been a court jester to King Henry I, and it was King Henry whom he appealed to for the charter. But more on that in a bit. I would venture to say that the charter allowed the fair to take place. It outlined the location and the duration. It also probably suspended local authorities from collecting tolls. There's a book from the 19th century that goes into detail about the fair's charter. It has a very long title, so I'll only give part of it here, but it's called The Records of St. Bartholomew's Priory, and I recommend checking it out if charters are your thing.
We will link to the full book in today's show notes so you can read that. But why was this charter held at Smithfield? What was important about Smithfield as the location?
So Smithfield was the location of the fair because that was the site of the Priory of St. Bartholomew. Fairs in England during the Middle Ages were usually connected with a church. Now, the location of the Priory has a more interesting history. Most sources on Bartholomew Fair were written in the 19th century, and all of them relate varied but similar stories of King Henry's former court jester, a man named Rayer. Rayer becomes a monk, and he travels to Rome as an act of repentance. England at this time was still connected to the Catholic Church, so Rome was a major site for pilgrimages. While in Rome, Rayer becomes gravely ill, almost to the point of death. He bargains with God that if he should be spared, he would go back to England and build a hospital for the poor. Rayer then has a vision of St. Bartholomew the Apostle, who tells Rayer that he has chosen a spot in the suburbs of London called Smithfield, where the monks should build a church and hospital in the saint's name. So Rayer regains his health and returns to London. He learns that Smithfield is the location of the King's Market, where a weekly cattle market and annual cloth fair take place. Rayer appeals to King Henry, who grants him some of the land, and he thus makes good on his promise to God and builds the Priory of St. Bartholomew and eventually the hospital, now known as Bart's.
How did an event that began as a meat market become this large, potentially international annual fair?
So Encyclopedia Britannica says that Bartholomew Fair was a cloth and meat market, but my impression is that from the beginning, Bartholomew Fair was known as a cloth fair, and it became a meat market later, probably in the 19th century. Today, Smithfield is part of London, and it's known for having one of the largest meat markets in the world. Bartholomew Fair was an international fair early on. The 19th century volume, Romance of London, Strange Stories, Scenes, and Remarkable Persons of the Great Town, notes that traders from all parts came to Smithfield, not merely of England, but all countries. So the fair did grow and change. It eventually spread beyond the Priory, and outside of the Priory is where I imagine most of the entertainment took place. The cloth fair became less relevant probably around Queen Elizabeth's reign, and English author Henry Benjamin Wheatley notes that better communication and transportation made drapers, those who sold cloth, and clothiers, those who made clothes, less reliant on fairs for trade. He goes on to say that the market aspect of the fair became less important, and so the entertainment became a bigger part of it, and it grew into a kind of carnival.
Shakespeare refers to Bartholomew Tide in his plays, suggesting that the day before St. Bartholomew's Day was a significant enough time in his life that his audience would know what he was talking about when he gives it this kind of side mention. It turns out the event of Bartholomew Fair officially began on Bartholomew Tide. Was Bartholomew Fair held at the same time every year, and was this something of a holiday for Shakespeare and the 16th century Londoner?
Yes. Fairs in England were all probably held at the same time every year, and they were usually held around the feast day of some saint. Bartholomew Fair was held annually around the feast day of St. Bartholomew, which is August 24th. The fair's duration changed throughout the centuries, but early on it was held for 3 days. It was opened by the Lord Mayor of London on the eve of the feast day, and it continued through the feast day itself and the day after. At some point, the fair was extended to 14 days, and then later it shrank back down to 3. Bartholomew Tide was a holiday for Shakespeare, and I recommend reading Francois Larocque's Shakespeare's Festive World for a discussion on that.
The events at the fair included many acts of performance, with some records suggesting the fair featured, because you talked about the entertainment eclipsing the cloth trade, but this entertainment, we're not talking just, one theater performance. This fair featured sideshows, prize fighters, musicians, wire walkers, acrobats, puppets, freaks, and even wild animals. Yes. Was this event very popular? Did it continue to draw people in after it wasn't necessarily focused on the commercial aspects of cloth trade?
Yes, absolutely. Judging by the mentions of the word crowds in many of the 19th century histories and the crammed engravings I've seen identified as Bartholomew Fair, I would say it was pretty popular. And it was attended by everyone. All of the histories say that people from every class and every stage of life attended it. It was for the young, the old, the upper classes, lower classes, locals, and international visitors.
Does that mean Shakespeare would have been at this event?
Ooh, good question. Ooh, I don't know if Shakespeare went to the event, and we don't necessarily know if he would have had his players. There's no mention of Shakespeare's company, neither Lord Chamberlain's men nor the King's men. They're not mentioned in the 19th century histories. But as we said, there were many kinds of performances in addition to these sort of acrobatics. We know that early on there were mystery plays, which are dramas based on such scriptural events as the creation or the flood. And we also know that there were puppet shows, which you mentioned, and we see that in Ben Jonson's Bartholomew Fair. There were theatrical booths, which are not really booths in the way we think of them today, but they were temporary stages set above the crowd. But those, we think, probably came after Shakespeare. So the 18th century seems to have been the heyday for plays at the fair. We know that the Beggar's Opera was performed in 1729, and the comedy Wat Tyler and Jack Straw was presented in 1730.
So certainly people like, Richard Burbage or Will Kemp or these actors that were playing in the theater houses that Shakespeare was connected with, some of them, and even Shakespeare himself, could have gone to this. And certainly it was a fixture in the culture of when he was living, but we don't know for sure, obviously, if Shakespeare, actually set foot over there, but it was a part of when he was playing. Did actors do that? Did they go to Bartholomew Fair to pick up like a side job?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I'm not sure if it was a side job, but we do know that there were actors in London who did go to Bartholomew Fair and performed there. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that there were some performances where actors would pull people from the crowd and force them to take some of the parts, and not just like side parts, but like lead parts. But I think you'd have to go into some of the really voluminous books on Bartholomew Fair to get a good idea of what was going on. Like I would say Henry Morley's memoirs of Bartholomew Fair goes into it in I think greater detail.
Now, what about sports at Bartholomew Fair? Would there have been things like jousting or archery?
Ooh, archery. Interesting. There probably wasn't jousting during the fair, but Britannica says that Smithfield was a spot for jousting tournaments at other times. We know that there were tournaments held during Richard II's reign. And the English academic who I just mentioned, Henry Morley, he seems to suggest that Smithfield was a location for sports, such sports as wrestling and lawn bowling. And because of this, the fair probably had those as well. It's kind of hard to say. He does discuss medieval drawings that show some feats of skill that may have been performed for money in the early days of the fair. And some of them seem kind of brutal. One of them is a woman balancing on her hands on the tips of swords. And another shows a woman standing on stilts while balancing a jug on her head and a baby in her arms.
Gracious.
But really, Smithfield, yeah, I know, quite violent. And it gets more violent. So Smithfield is actually better known as a site of executions. In fact, it is said to be the location where William Wallace, who was famously portrayed by Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart, was hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered.
Wow. So a lot of reputations connected to Smithfield, which may or may not be associated with what went on at the fair.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
In Wordsworth's The Prelude from 1805, he talks about Indians and dwarfs being at Bartholomew Fair. And in Shakespeare's The Tempest, Shakespeare writes that, quote, "They will not give a doit to relieve a lame beggar. They will lazy out 10 to see a dead Indian." That was a rough quoting of The Tempest there, but is the they that Shakespeare's talking about here referencing actual events at Bartholomew Fair, in the sense of, would there have been Native Americans on display at this event?
The painted Indians William Wordsworth mentions in his description of Bartholomew Fair, it's intriguing, but the contemporary histories of Bartholomew Fair do not mention Native Americans on display. We know that there were Native Americans in London at this time. Several sources note that in the 16th century, the explorer Martin Frobisher brought Native Americans back to London from his expeditions to North America. And one Native American is said to have died before reaching England, and his body was allegedly displayed for a fee, not necessarily at the fair. But some have mused that this event may be what Trinculo in The Tempest is referring to when he says that very difficult line, "They will not give a doit to relieve a lame beggar. They will lazy out 10 to see a dead Indian."
In Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, the line appears about a poor Wat, a sad, pitiful creature, when he says, quote, "By this poor Wat, far off upon a hill, stands on his hinder legs with listening ear, to hearken if his foes pursue him still. Anon their loud alarums he doth hear, and now his grief may be compared well to one sore sick that hears the passing bell." It sounds like an execution scene, which leads me to ask about who the character of poor Wat might have been. You pointed out that Smithfield was a location for executions. And when I looked into the history of Bartholomew Fair, there is a famous Wat named Wat Tyler, who met his demise by taking on none other than Richard II himself at Smithfield. Was this Wat such a folk figure in early modern culture that Shakespeare might have been invoking the Wat Tyler of Smithfield with this line?
Very interesting question. Shakespeare probably was aware of the historic figure Wat Tyler. Marjorie Garber noted that he conflates Jack Cade's rebellion, the 1450 rebellion in Henry VI Part 2, with that of Wat Tyler's 1381 rebellion. And this 1381 rebellion is the Peasants' Revolt, which was one of the first popular rebellions in England. Tyler was provoked by the poll tax of that year, so he led a group of rebels to London to demand social and economic reforms. So he and his rebels met with King Richard II in Smithfield for negotiations. A fight broke out and Tyler was wounded. He was taken to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, from where he was later dragged away and executed. But we don't know if he was executed in Smithfield. I didn't see anything on that. So Shakespeare was aware of Wat Tyler, but it's hard to say that an awareness meant he was a folk hero during his time, though. Shakespeare doesn't mention the Peasants' Revolt in Richard II, but that play covers the end of Richard's reign, whereas the rebellion took place earlier in his tenure. Many sources note that Wat is an obsolete term for hair, and that's probably what's meant in Venus and Adonis.
Okay. In Ben Jonson's play Bartholomew Fair, he uses his annual event, this annual event, as the setting for his play. And the play itself is this hilarious romp through the more disreputable part of London society. Was that a reasonable description of the fair itself? You mentioned that all classes came to this event, but what was the atmosphere it created in the city every August?
Yeah, well, the disreputable part of London society was definitely present. All the histories mentioned that there were beggars, pickpocketers, con artists, prostitutes, and pimps there. And for centuries, there were always those who thought that the fair was a place of debauchery. It was definitely a carnival. There were acrobats, tightrope walkers, fortune tellers, and so-called freak shows. There were also vendors who sold gingerbread, food, refreshments of the drinking kind, and toys. So there was a general atmosphere of overall merriment, I would say. It was definitely a bit of a party. And most people who did attend the fair, they knew that there was a risk of having their wallets stolen, but that wasn't enough of a drawback to keep them away.
This is such an exciting topic, and I know you have already mentioned several books that we will link to in today's show notes, but I do want to ask you, what are some of your favorite resources? Are there other books and resources that you'll recommend for us to learn more about Bartholomew Fair?
Yes. Well, in addition to those I've mentioned already, I'll include some more 19th century volumes, and they include Walter Thornberry's Old and New London, a narrative of its history, its people, and its places, and Cornelius Walford's Fairs, Past and Present, a chapter in the history of commerce.
We will link to both of those, as well as the others you've mentioned today, in the show notes for today's episode. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yes. Well, I'm imagining, since I have so much time, I should probably ask for an entire set of Encyclopedia Britannica. And yeah, I would gain so much knowledge with Shakespeare and the Bible. But I think maybe, to be real, I would want something a little more lively, probably Emma or Sense and Sensibility. I could read both books hundreds of times and learn something new.
Those are excellent choices for sure. And I think you would be set up very well there. It is interesting to me that everyone assumes they're going to be on their deserted island for a long time. And until you said that, yes. I didn't realize that actually in the question, you don't have to be there for a long time. So.
It could just be a day.
Yeah, you could just visit.
But without the distractions, I could really focus on, those encyclopedias and just learn everything about the world in 24 hours.
Yes, I think that's fabulous. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, so one of my favorite things to do at Encyclopedia Britannica is to write articles on such well-known artworks as The Last Supper and The Starry Night. So I have a few of those in the works that I'll be publishing in the coming months. And at Britannica, we have a few collaborations we're working on, including an encyclopedia for kids. And we're doing that with the Britannica books imprint at What on Earth Publishing.
We will definitely look forward to seeing those come out. And I have enjoyed our time here together. Thank you so much for stopping by and sharing with us the history of Bartholomew Fair.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Come join me over on the website in the show notes for today's episode to talk about Bartholomew Fair. I've also included some images of what Bartholomew Fair looked like when it was performed, as well as links to Alicia's article for Encyclopedia Britannica, along with the numerous exciting resources she recommends for you today, and a link to the episode with Francois Leroc, who has been a guest here with us at That Shakespeare Life, and you can hear his episode talking about Shakespeare's festive world all over in the show notes for today's episode. Check that out and more at CassidyCash.com/EP83. That's CassidyCash.com/EP83. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.